Is this a fate of India that we just got to accept?
You're right. I think it's a structural feature of the Indian economy.
What does India need more of?
Education, in a very different sense, has been a channel for upward social mobility, but also a question of dignity.
In the marriage market, whether it's for men or for women, showing that you're a graduate is now a big deal.
35 to 40% has been the graduate unemployment rate.
Less than about 7% finally get salaried employment.
Is queuing or waiting better, or is having a fallback better?
This is a tough one. um,
Hi everyone, I'm Kashish, and in this conversation I'm talking to the authors of State of Working India Report 2026. Rosa Abraham and Tamoghna are professors at Azim Premji Universities, and they have authored this report. This is the 5th edition of the report, and they've been writing it since 2017. This report is all about labor markets in India, and I really thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. In this conversation, we talked about a lot of micro aspects of the employment market in India, starting from education, talking about women in employment, talking about SCSTs, identities, and a lot more. Everything from migration to what it takes for a youth to get into the employment market. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you guys enjoy it as well. Thank you so much for getting on this call. Really happy and honestly feeling very proud that you guys did agree to do this. To start off, why don't you just, both of you, give us a brief as to what you do at APU, and especially what does the Center of Sustainable Employment does, and then we can get on to talking about the report itself.
so I'll start. I'm Rosa. I teach economics at Azim Premji University. I'm also a part of the Center for Sustainable Employment. So CSE is a part of the labor vertical of the Center for the Study of the Indian Economy, which is a larger research center within the university. My work over the last 7-8 years as being a part of CSE involves looking at questions around the labor market, and a lot of the work that I've been doing has come out in the form of the State of Working India reports, which CSE has published over the last few years from 2018. And right now we're in the 5th iteration of the report. Besides that, in terms of teaching, I teach a course on Indian economy. I also teach a development economics course at the university.
I have been associated with the university for 5 years now, and primarily within the School of Arts and Sciences. I teach economics and other courses. Generally, my research interest has been on questions of identity, whether in contemporary time or going back in economic history, largely around caste, but also gender. Broadly speaking, I like to do research in a sort of a team and collective manner. And that's where I think when I joined after that, I got to see the kind of exciting work that Rosa and others were doing in Center for Sustainable Employment, particularly the State of Working India report. And that's when I got associated with the report first in 2023. That was my first time getting associated. And I was also learning at that point how to actually do research. What does it even mean to do research collectively? And from there on, in the last report, 2026 report, that journey has been quite amazing in terms of contributing towards the report collectively. And yeah.
So I guess that collective effort does reflect in the report itself. The list of contributing authors is huge, and the density at which you guys have touched on really micro aspects of the labor market is indeed commendable. Before I actually get into the report, if one of you could just in 2-3 sentences talk about what is the report actually trying to answer? What's that one question that the report is trying to answer, which is sort of like a small elevator pitch about what the report is about, and then eventually we can get deeper into it.
I'm going to give this a shot. So, yeah. Actually, maybe I'll tell you the original story of the report. When we did the previous iteration of the report, which was the SWI 2023, one of the things that kind of got a lot of attention was the fact that graduate unemployment rate was amongst young graduates was very high. And so that sort of started the question within the group and amongst a lot of us on what's going on. So this report really was trying to look at what is happening with the youth in the labor market in terms of why is it that unemployment rates are so high amongst graduates? What do young workers do, or what do youth do once they finish education? How do they go about finding work? How long do they look for jobs? And then what do they finally end up as? I mean, that's broadly what we were trying to look at. But in the course of writing the report, it became 242 pages where we ended up looking at a lot more and, going into a lot of depth with each of these questions.
So throughout the report, you've talked about a lot of concepts, but one thing that really stood out for me was the fact, the approach you took towards the report, where you narrated the report through the life cycle of a youth who, before entering the job market, while they're searching for it, and eventually getting into the job market. So before, rather than me butchering the concept, I'll let you guys just briefly explain the life cycle. And then eventually I would want to drill down on each life cycle or each point in that life cycle, the questions that I had.
Yeah. I mean, so if we were to look at it, because it's the state of work in India, maybe the starting point would naturally have been to look at the employment outcomes of young workers. But as we were thinking about this, we realized that employment outcomes, it's really difficult to separate at least the initial employment outcomes with what went on behind that. So what we call as the pre-labor market choices. And that's when we realized that questions around higher education, skilling, all of these are crucial to understanding what eventually happens later on. So that's why Tamoghna and I had extensive discussions on this, and we realized that really the life cycle approach was the way to look at it. And so we needed to kind of take a few steps back and not just look at employment outcomes, but we start with questions around higher education and skilling. Of course, you can say, well, nutrition, primary schooling, all of this also have a role to play in final labor market outcomes. But we were very clear we didn't want to go that far back. And I think there might be other reports that come out that might look at some of these as well. So we said, okay, let's start with questions around higher education. So that's one of the first boxes in the life cycle. What do they study? How long do they study? And then from there, now the school to work transition. And so that intermediate stage of how do you go about looking for jobs? What are your networks that you use? Do you use networks? Again, how long do you wait for a job? So that's the school to work transition question. And then finally, actually, to look at employment outcomes. So actually, if you look at it, the employment outcome itself is actually one big chapter of the report, but the report actually contains a lot more on the pre-labor market questions and also the post, the policy implications as well. So that's really the life cycle that we wanted to take with this report.
Let me start with, the phase one itself, the pre-labor market. And in that, you'd made an observation how the number of higher education institutions over the past couple of years has gone up a lot. But at the same time, we saw that the teacher to student ratio had dropped drastically, which is well below what is acceptable by the AICTE norms, right? And all this while, we also have complaints from employers saying that people aren't really employable. The graduates aren't really employable. This led me to the question, understanding that I've always thought education as an investment in human capital of skill building. But at the same time, it has a social signaling angle to it, both of which have been addressed in your report. I want to understand that after all the observations we are making about maybe the quality of education going down, is it that we are failing on the fact it no more is an investment in human capital and it's all just about social signaling, or am I being too harsh on that observation?
In terms of the two roles of education, this is how literature looks at it, right? That education is either it's a way to learn things that you don't know, or it's a way to signal to an employer that, hey, I've got a degree. It's irrelevant whether the degree actually taught you anything, but the fact that you've signaled a degree is another way to enter into the labor market. Now, I feel like it's very hard to dismiss or to kind of pin down on whether it's one or the other. And more the literature says that both of these have a role to play. But you're right that over time, what's happened is that because of this erosion of education in terms of, the quality of education, just not having enough teachers, not having enough classroom infrastructure and so on. So I think in the Indian context, what's happening is that education still has a signaling role. In a lot of the higher income countries, actually, we are now seeing a lot of employers saying that you don't need to show a degree certificate. You come in, do a few tests and write attend the interview, and they're able to discern whether you're fit. That's not something that has happened in India as yet. So I do think that the role of the degree as an entry ticket is still very much there. we can't discount that as yet.
There are also a couple of additional questions around the question of the social particularly. Is that education has been for a long time seen, particularly higher education, has been for a long time been seen as a default option for particularly the privileged caste groups. Now, in that context, particularly for the marginalized caste groups, education, in a very different sense, has been a channel for upward social mobility, but also a question of dignity. That's where higher education, whether or not you are actually learning something, which is again, the metrics are not necessarily very clear. That how do we even capture real learning, real employability, real skills? These are a bit blurry, but regardless of what one is learning, I think the very fact that you are actually entering a college and going out of a college with a degree, that adds to a certain kind of social prestige, which is the reason why, unless all the paths are blocked for you, you would like to actually go to a college and get a degree, even beyond the returns in the labor market, whatever be the labor market returns be. So I think that's where we do see this flourish of the numbers that we are presenting in the report here.
But there's another data point in your report where you were talking about, the male tertiary enrollment actually falling since 2017. It fell from 38% to 34%, right? And the reason a lot of men were dropping out was to support and supplement their household income. That leads me to ask, is it now that people are eventually realizing that they're making a rational economic calculation, whether it makes sense for them to enroll in a private engineering college, maybe as a placeholder, where they might not end up getting employed at a point where they want to get employed, and the engineering degree itself is not paying for it, so they're better off just dropping off. Is that a valid assertion to make, or am I missing something?
Yeah, I think it's too early to make that assertion. I'm not saying that it may not be playing out, but I would be cautious about going down that track. And I'll tell you two reasons why I think that it's too early to make this. One is, so the point that you make when you ask these men why they are not in education, when it's an age when they should be in tertiary education. So the survey does ask them why you're not in education, and like you said, a large share, so most of the increase or the withdrawal from education can be explained by the fact that men are citing that they need to supplement household incomes. Right? Now, another option that was also asked in response to why you are not in education, they also asked education, you did not feel that education was necessary. Now, if it really was the fact that these households are factoring that, oh, education is not giving them anything, then you would think that that would be the predominant response, or at least more and more men would be reporting that. But we don't see any change in that. That number is actually very, very small, and it doesn't increase in that 2017 to 2024 time period. So that's one reason why I would be averse to saying that households are now trying to factor in. The second thing is that, sure, the graduate premium has dampened from 2017 to 2024. It has dampened, and that is amongst men, not amongst women. But again, it's too early for them to make that decision on withdrawing from education, because even though a graduate premium is dampening is a very recent phenomenon, but also even despite the dampening, you're still seeing that the average graduate earns double a non-graduate, right? So the premium still very much exists. So there is still a value, and we in the report we also calculate this returns on investment in education. That suppose you didn't invest in education, you don't forego those years in labor market. What was your subsequent earnings over your entire lifetime? The returns on investment in education still remains very high because it gives you an entryway into salaried jobs. It gives you an entryway into good occupations as well. So the premium still exists. So I think it's still too early. And then, as Tamoghna said, there is a social prestige that even if the returns are dampening in the marriage market, whether it's for men or for women, showing that you're a graduate is now a big deal. You can't. It's not easy to find a partner without this kind of at least a degree, right? So I think we are not there yet that households are able to make this kind of, I don't know if you'd call it a rational choice that, oh, premiums are reducing, so we don't need to study anymore.
Valid. Actually, doubling down on this only, another stat that comes to my mind in your report was that enrollment, especially in the lower quartile of economic strata, it has doubled to, I guess, 15%, right? But at the same time, we know for a fact that the cost of education, like education inflation, is one of the highest in India, right next to medical inflation. We've seen the cost of medical degree, engineering degree go up. And quoting your report only, it mentions how cost of education, especially in these fields, is much more than the annual income of the household for the lowest quartile. So when we see enrollment numbers in the lower quartile gradually increasing, but at the same time, a lot of these degrees still out of reach for them financially, is it even right for us to look at those enrollment numbers? Do they even mean anything? Or are these enrollment numbers just like a tick mark exercise that they end up getting enrolled in a college just for the sake of it, and which might or might not materially improve their chances of being employable in the future?
Yeah, I think I agree that the enrollment does mislead that you, and this is when you look at enrollment rates by caste or gender, you will see, especially for women, you see that the enrollment gap is completely closed. But then there are obviously kind of gendered patterns, and there's also patterns by class and caste as well. So yes, the enrollment does mislead, but I think that what has happened is that your educational degrees that are associated with high returns in the labor market are systematically not really affordable for marginalized caste households or for poorer households as well. Now, to that extent, yes, it does mislead, and we need to think more about access to education, and that's where the role of affirmative action in education, subsidizing education especially for engineering and medicine, becomes crucial. But I also just want to make a slightly more, I don't know if it's philosophical, but I think we need to also stop thinking of education purely from this very instrumental role of like getting you a degree afterwards, right? There is also a certain value in being in a campus, meeting peers from different groups, interacting with different communities. There is a huge learning that comes from there, which is also then I'll say that premiums are dampening, but do we then say, oh, we shouldn't have campuses anymore? I think there's a huge learning process and learning which may not have a labor market return, but perhaps we need to not value everything on that. Very uncharacteristic of an economist to say. But Tamoghna, if you want to add.
Absolutely agreed. Yeah, I think, and I think that also is a part which, at risk of digressing, I think education as a project of nation building and citizen, a shared kind of citizenry, is a completely different aspect altogether. So the returns to labor market is a very limited way of understanding the premium of that. Yeah.
Fair enough. So, I mean, that's a digression which was worth taking, but I'll bring you back to the topic of employment. And in your report, you mentioned how 35 to 40% has been the graduate unemployment rate since 1983, and this has more or less remained that way. One thing that led me to this question was ki, is this the natural graduate unemployment rate for us as India, or is it more like a crisis that can be solved? Matlab, I just want to ask that, is this a fate of India that we just got to accept as a feature of India? Or do we consider it as a bug worth solving, a crisis worth solving? Because apparently, for the past 40 years, even though we have seen a lot of progress in terms of education, employment, what all, this number doesn't budge at all.
You're right. I think it's a structural feature of the Indian economy, but I think maybe it's a structural feature that we may be giving too much attention to, because on the one hand, the high graduate unemployment could reflect that you just don't have enough jobs and you're waiting. But on the other hand, like we also show, it means that more and more households are they can afford to wait, right? Now, if we accept that maybe household incomes have gone and there's this affordability aspects and they're sort of queuing up for the job, well, that on its own is not a bad thing. Then the question then becomes, is that does the wait pay off? And I think that is the important question where, and this probably points towards a more recent phenomenon where the wait is probably not paying off as much as it did earlier. I will say that it's very hard to substantiate this, because if you really want to answer this question of does waiting longer pay off, and what is this historically, you need information on the same workers that are tracked over during the wait period and subsequently over many generations, which is very hard to get. But at least some initial and through other kinds of analysis, it seems to suggest that the wait is not paying off. So then I think the worrying number, not the graduate unemployment, the young graduate unemployment, the more worrying number is that within a year, and we see in the report that even after waiting a year, only about less than about 7% actually finally of graduates actually finally get salaried employment, which is, I think, the cause for worry. And somehow, and that is probably can't convincingly say that it's a recent phenomenon, but then it says that it's a result that we've just not been able to create the kind of good jobs for this highly educated, highly aspirational cohort of young workers. And because the scale of the problem has become so large now, because we have so many more youngsters in the economy, we have so many more graduates who are youngsters in the economy, then the demand on job creation has also become massive. And we just have not been able to keep up with that demand. So I think that is more the problem. The weight which, and I think the young graduate high unemployment is reflective largely of a weight, is a problem to some extent, but I think that's not the biggest problem.
Fair enough. And I want you to also contextualize that with another concept that you introduced in your report called the fallback. Either you can wait or you can fall back to a job which might not be the best suitable job for you, but it still helps you on that buck for your family and still manage to live a life hoping and aspiring for a much better job. According to you, and again, I'm putting you on a spot here with a very wrong and a very difficult question, but what do you think is better for an economy? And when I say that purely from getting the maximum out of our human capital. Is queuing or waiting better, or is having a fallback better?
This is a tough one. um, okay, so when you mean who is it better for, right? Now, is it at an individual level, when you're thinking about queuing, you are thinking about somebody who's probably sitting at home and what we call as the unemployed. Maybe they're preparing for exams, or maybe they're doing some kind of skill upgradation. In that situation, then that queuing takes a certain productive form where you are skilling, you're upgrading, then perhaps in the long run, there's some returns to that wait that it takes place. But you also know, we're all well aware that a lot of wait happens in the form of not very productive use of time, potentially engaging in activities that are not very good for the economy, good for the nation, good for individuals. So activities that are not necessarily, I'm not sure what the right word is, but not really productive. Let's put it as that. Now that can potentially be individually and at a macro level massively damaging. On the other hand, let's look at the other one, which is the entry under some kind of employment and what we refer to as underemployment as the fallback, and that could involve moving jobs, moving to different areas, searching for jobs. And Tamoghna can speak about what we see with the informal workers from the eShram database in terms of migration. Now, this kind of underemployment is fine if you also think that over time that there's a ladder to this, that you enter as something, you enter as some kind of just gig work or some kind of temporary work, which eventually translates into a pathway into a career. Now, what is happening is that underemployment is, which then becomes a pathway into good jobs, is not happening in India. So, and that I think is actually more worrisome, because then you're stuck with, people who are just stuck. There's a form of disgruntlement that comes with that stuckness. And you can see that playing out now in protests in Noida, right? You have, of course, the protest has been triggered by the fact of, by some recent announcements. But there's also a sense that, we've just been doing the same thing, but we are not seeing increase in salaries. We're not seeing positional increases as well. And that leads to other kinds of disgruntlement, which manifests in not very productive national ways. So I mean, nationally. So I think it's very hard to pick which is better at an individual or national sense. I think both of these can take very, very nasty forms and nasty manifestations. And that's why I think there's policy interventions in both forms of underemployment as well as unemployment. And I think the migrant story also points towards a lot of this kind of underemployment, searching for work out of distress. And Tamoghna, if you want to speak a little bit of what we are finding with migrant stories.
Yeah. So, and also like just to quickly add on to Rosa's point, I think maybe we can talk about this or we talk about policies, but largely speaking, when we are talking about good jobs in the Indian context, that also is embedded within the broader context of caste. So in many, many ways, what we think of potential good jobs in India is going to look kind of different than what we would think, let's say, good jobs in other particularly in Western countries. So a job that has some kind of physical labor and broadly physical labor embedded in it is not necessarily a bad job in a country which is developed, so on and so forth. But in our case, that is not an aspirational job. That actually suddenly becomes fallback. That becomes a fallback job when you are going and working on a factory floor. So this differentiation also matters in the way the decisions are being taken by individual actors. So the broader embedding of it once again comes back to some of the fundamental hierarchies that we see in the society and how the economy arranges itself around those hierarchies. But coming back to the migration question, I think a couple of things that we really find interesting is that I think there are three broad trends that we pick up. And just for the audience, we are talking about unorganized sector migration. So we are not necessarily talking about all the techies from Kolkata who are living around Whitefield. We are not really talking about them, but we are talking about essentially the construction worker who has migrated to, let's say, Pune or Bengaluru via informal networks, contractors, so on and so forth. Largely the unorganized sector migration. And within the unorganized sector migration, what we do find is that there are three kinds of flows, three kinds of forces that are driving this migration. One is broadly the flow of migration is coming from relatively weaker states in terms of the state domestic product and so on and so forth towards relatively stronger states, relatively better performing states in that sense. Second, it is flowing from, of course, there are a couple of exceptions that exist, but largely it is flowing from states that are younger to states that are older. So there is also a age channel and in some sense balancing out of this huge youth bulge that we see in certain states. A certain kind of balancing out is happening through migration. And the third thing that we see is certainly this is not something new, but often we see this at an anecdotal level because we do see, let's say, in our neighborhood, we might see that there are, let's say, private security guards from a particular area in the country where they have come from. Along with them, we also see, let's say, domestic health or construction workers coming in, and all of them share a similar kind of language, so on and so forth. So you do see these clusterings of people coming from a similar state and residing at a particular area within the destination. And this is largely the network effect in some sense that I know someone from my village, from my district who has gone out, and I know provides me with some kind of informal social safety net that if something happens in this unknown land, there will be at least a known face who can guide me in settling down there. And we do find that this network also is playing quite a bit of role. For example, we find workers from West Bengal largely concentrated in Kerala, for that matter. Or we see that workers from Madhya Pradesh is actually just around the border of Madhya Pradesh. They're not really traveling too far. They're just around the state border. So I think these are some of the interesting channels of migration that you find on how migration is happening and how it is adjusting A, the economy, B, the age imbalances, and finally, how it is all being mitigated through the networks. Yeah.
So the migration story is honestly very fascinating. We have states like UP, Bihar, which are younger, and also, relatively poorer states who are the net senders of all this labor migration going out, and states in the south, which are relatively much more advanced economically and also relatively aging, are the net receivers. And that sort of balances out the differences, which may have been a problem, but I don't know, the labor economics just find its way to balance itself out. So that's really fascinating. But coming to the part, after, let's say, people do end up finding job, and I guess this is something, Tamoghna, you would be able to better answer. In the report, there was mention of how earlier all these employment opportunities, let's say, in footwear and leather industries, they were dominated by SC/STs because those employments were more associated socially with that sect of people. But that employment has come down from 40% of total employment in that sector by the folks in SC/ST category. It's now coming down to 24%. So I guess that's good progress. But my question here is that where is that migration happening to? Is it happening to other adjacent lower end of the economic value chain? Is it like they're moving to construction, or is it folks moving to upward mobility into higher end of the economic activity? I don't know, maybe other services industry, IT or whatnot. So what does that migration look like, especially when it comes to the identity of SCST folks?
Where they are going in that sense, I think it is largely within manufacturing. So it is not necessarily that the answer is that the movement is not necessarily happening from there to directly to IT. The dominant destination is largely around different types of manufacturing. So it is still in some sense physical labor. But I would still like to bring in I'd like to zoom out from that fact a little bit and think of it in terms of horizontal versus vertical mobility in some sense, which is to say that if you are within a traditional occupation, which is almost the quote unquote curse of your birth, if you are moving out of that and maybe you are still stuck in within some kind of broader physical labor intensive kind of work, even then this going out of what is known as the traditional occupation is in some sense a mobility. This may not be a vertical upward mobility in terms of income, not necessarily in terms of the larger respect that you earn within the society, but at least this gives a first step of exit. So some of this is also, by the way, a lot of the earlier Ambedkarite thought would position itself around the exit from the rural economy and to be integrated in the urban economy. That is not to say that you are suddenly ending up in a in a brilliant economic situation within the urban economy as well. But at least it's the first step of exit. So that is something that we certainly pick up when we compare the two generations and we see the declining share of today's youth within those traditionally tied occupations. But I think the gender story is actually also quite fascinating in that sense.
I mean, I completely agree with Tamon, but it's also interesting that we do see that your modern services, so the IT and financial services, business support services, are also amongst the industries that have seen an increased share of young workers from SCST groups. Of course, occupationally and in terms of hierarchy where they fall, is probably, there might still be hierarchies there and there's still that kind of creating that happens. But I think in terms of just wages and prospects, this is definitely a mobility story for sure. For gender, again, very similar patterns. And I think with gender, there's a lot of other things and we can come back to that. But again, we're seeing that this modern services economy, the business support services, but also manufacturing, textiles, very good barrel. These have become major employers of young women as well, which is also something which is very recent, especially the entry of young women into manufacturing. Again, also points towards higher earnings as well.
That's a valid observation. Now, before I wrap up, just a couple of last questions I have. Throughout the report, we talk a lot about the supply end of things, the supply aspect of labor, right? We talk about education, skilling. I wanted to shift the focus a bit on the demand side. Where is the demand for that labor coming from? And the Indian economy is such where we have a huge skew of very small enterprises which are not able to scale, but they're still one of the largest employers of people in the country. If, we were to solve the graduate unemployment problem, let's say, what does India need more of? Do we need more of such MSME firms spread across the country, continue hiring a lot of people, even though they won't really enter the formal sector because the smaller the company, there are no formal salary structures, they don't come under the PF guidelines, all of that? Or do we need more of Tata's, Birla's, Ambani's, larger corporate houses hiring more and more people? I know there's no right answer, but what do you guys think about that?
So I think my inclination would be towards we need to build up the middle that we've kind of hollowed out, which was our small and middle, with small and medium sized enterprises. And multiple reasons for this is because one, these are also enterprises that tend to be labor intensive. Even if you scale up a large business, the capacity to hire more workers is going to be constrained simply because they will move towards capital intensive. Small and medium is where you can grow and also create jobs with growth. So, even if you were to provide credit to small and medium, that would be directed towards more and more. I mean, the capacity, the potential employment creation from credit allocation is going to be much higher as against value go into a larger business. And I think that is one big reason, but also just from a welfare perspective, right? I think we all know that monopolies, having these large firms which control a large section of our markets also has very damaging effects on consumer welfare as well, purely from the economic top. And I think there is value in having number of small firms. It brings about competition. It makes sure that prices also remain competitive, right? And I think that's also another, and it's not from an employment creation perspective, but just purely from the welfare perspective. And I think that's where the policy levers need to intervene, because a lot of the constraints, and I'm not talking about the labor reform kind of constraints, but the constraints around registering your business, even exiting from a business, or having R&D, support for R&D, these things are really it's a binding constraint for the small firms, not for the larger firms. And I think the exit is something that we don't talk about enough, that I think we don't have the luxury to fail anymore. So the many of these small and medium enterprises, there is of course the fear in scaling, because there's a huge penalty and it's difficult to exit. And I think we need to be allowing the exit to happen. I think recently there was some discussion around where does R&D take place. You would think that, the large firms, the large family enterprises would be investing a lot in R&D. We're not seeing that happening in India. When have we when have any of our family businesses actually invented something or developed something locally? We're not seeing that. More and more, the model is about mergers, acquisitions, acquiring businesses. And that's where I think, again, small and medium is where there is potential to innovate. There is an urge or an incentive to innovate. So again, one more reason to be focusing on that side in terms of the demand creation.
One last question I had before I let you guys go, and I want you guys to answer it in as succinct manner possible. You guys have been working on it for 7-8 years. This is the 5th edition of the report. Over these 5 editions, do you see the trend going up or down? Are we getting better off when it comes to labor market, or are we going worse? And another thing that in the report mentions, by 2030 we'll reach that demographic dividend peak. It's just 5 years away now, 4 years rather. Are we too late to translate that into good economic dividend for us country? These are the 2 questions I have.
Come on, do you want to go first on this?
No, because I have not been associated with the report since 2017. This is only my second one. So yeah, I'll let Rosa answer it and then I'll add.
Okay, okay. So yes, 5 years of the report, and what have we seen? I think that from 2017, we're seeing things that we've not seen before. 2 things being the withdrawal of men from education and the re-entry of women into agriculture, which is both very, very worrying trends. So in that sense, I am pessimistic. But here's where I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because if you see the last few budgets, we're seeing a recognition that this is a problem. I think the interventions on that recognition have not been maybe as not what at least one would expect. There's still scope to do a lot more. But what I'm seeing now, and this is something that, we've also talked about in various editions when we release a report, that the crisis in the labor market has become a mainstream discussion, which I think is something that we are very, in a way, happy that report has somewhat contributed to. And people are talking about it, understanding some of the nuances. So that's where I'm optimistic about that. Since it's entered into mainstream conversation, it's only a matter of time, and policy has already recognized that there is a problem. And I think that's a big step. So in that sense, I am optimistic. But you're right, clock is ticking. It's only a matter of time. And as we say in the report that, are we going to grow old before we get rich? We are potentially going down that path. But the thing is, again, like we say, the infrastructure is in place. We have our schools, we have our colleges, we have the school to, the National Career Services Scheme that can actually link workers and employers. It's just about how do we synergize this. And I think that's where policy really needs to step up.
Just to quickly add on the point, the larger stories which the numbers are telling, one can interpret it in their own sort of ways, in their own sort of context, etc. But what I really think has 2 things that have changed over the last, I would say, broadly, since 2010 would be a good way to put it. But yeah, let's say broadly in last 10-15 years. One, just like Rosa was mentioning about the importance of acknowledging the crisis of labor market, Alongside that, I think that one thing that has really changed in last 10, 15 years is the word skill has become a buzzword. And now that has multiple implications, including the fact that many of the things that we did not earlier think about within our conversations in terms of the labor market, now you cannot actually ignore certain skill training programs, certain institutions that have been here in India for 75 years, all throughout the independence. Now we are actually finally looking at them. We are turning our gaze at these particular institutions, such as ITIs and others. And I think that focus is something from a policy perspective is going to be very crucial in the next few years. If we can do something positive on that side, if we can actually bring the prestige of vocational education, on which right now there is a lot of scrutiny going on and a lot of discussion going on, if we can bring it at the same level as the higher education, then I think that's going to be a fantastic outcome in some sense. The last thing that I wanted to point out is that sometimes as an economist, I really feel outdated in some sense in terms of understanding how exactly, for that matter, how exactly my students are, when I'm teaching, let's say, I really don't know if my students are learning the same way that I learned. And I actually am not in a place to sort of demand that they must learn in the same kind of way that I learned. The reason why I'm giving this analogy is we really don't know what today's youngsters, irrespective of their educational profile, their social profile, how do they look at labor market? So from my perspective, and I'm sure even from Rosa's perspective, and from a lot of economists' perspective, salaried employment, regular salaried employment, employment with contractual safeties, and all of those things are actually a good outcome. And I'm sure for a huge section of India that is true. But for the young, especially, I really don't know whether that remains the dream or not. Being an Instagram influencer and earning money, or just doing part time work and earning money through that. Are these real labor market options? Are these becoming labor market options? If so, are they only restricted to a certain strata of the society, or is it a widespread kind of a aspiration? I think coming years will get us to some answer, but at least right now I don't have that answer. So that's the blurry part for me when I try to think of path of employment going forward, personally speaking. Yeah.
I mean, that's all the questions I had. If there is anything I missed from the report that is worth talking about, the floor is yours. If not, it's been a lovely conversation, honestly. Is there anything we missed?
No, I think we've covered, yeah, I think most of it, most of the big points are there, but this was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Thank you so much, Tamoghna, for taking out the time. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks.